what do you think about when you think of the history of the United States? Is it the story of George Washington crossing the Delaware or of the Boston Tea Party? Maybe you think of the signing of the Declaration of Independence or the writing of the Constitution. But those iconic moments represent only a fraction of what it took to build a nation. And they aren't really tell us anything about how the United States grew from 13 colonies on the Atlantic coast to the vast country that we know today. In this course, we going to explore the many ways that people across the United States built their country from nothing. We'll travel west following Lewis and Clark and other explorers, mountain men and missionaries who pushed across an unsettled continent. We'll go north to see how people in the Northwest Territory established one of the first representative governments in American history. And we'll dig into the stories of early settlers in Texas and California as they fought for independence from foreign powers and then struggled to build new societies out of the land they claimed. But why is understanding the process of nation building so important? Well, if we want to be good citizens of the United States, we need to understand where our country came from. The story of the United States is not just a story of battles and documents, it is the story of building a nation from the ground up by exploring how people made their way across an unsettled continent, founded new societies and interacted with each other despite and sometimes because of their differences. We can better understand the foundations of the country we live in today. So let's jump in. The United States began as 13 separate colonies along the Atlantic coast. But even before Europeans arrived, it was home to hundreds of distinct societies with millions of people speaking hundreds of different languages. These societies had developed over thousands of years and were spread out over a huge area that stretched from the Great Lakes to the southern tip of Florida and all the way to the Pacific Ocean. Some were settled agricultural societies, like the Iroquois Confederacy in the northeast, or the Cherokee and Choctaw Nations in the southeast. Others were more nomadic, like the Sioux and Cheyenne in the Great Plains, or the Inuit in the far north. And some were still coming together as new nations when Europeans arrived. To learn more about the indigenous peoples who inhabited the land we call the United States today, check out Crash Course Native American Histories, available on its own course page or on the additional resources page for this course. During the colonial period, the British divided the interior of the continent into 3 regions: the Northwest Territory, New Spain, and the Louisiana Territory. Each of these areas was governed by a European power and was largely closed off to American settlement. At the same time, the British government realized that it couldn't afford to maintain large garrisons of troops in the colonies to protect them from potential conflicts with other European powers. So in 1763, the British government passed the Royal Proclamation, which forbade colonial settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains. This policy had the unintended consequence of pushing Americans to explore and settle in the region anyway. In 1778, Spain ceded most of the lands between the Mississippi River and the Rocky Mountains to the newly independent United States. This doubled the size of the country and opened up incredible possibilities for exploration and settlement. But there was a problem. The United States didn't have the resources to mount expeditions into the interior to find out what was there, or to defend settlers who ventured too far from the established colonial areas. Luckily, Americans found a solution in the famous cause of discovery, an expedition led by Meriwether Lewis and William Clark. President Thomas Jefferson commissioned Lewis and Clark to explore the Louisiana Purchase and report back on its resources and potential for settlement. The pair set off with a crew of about 40 men in 1804 and traveled up the Missouri River to the Pacific Northwest. Their journey took them through the lands of many different tribes, including the Mandan and Hidatsa people, who became crucial allies for the expedition. After reaching the Pacific Ocean in 1805, Lewis and Clark returned east, bringing back with them dozens of plants, animals, and minerals that were unknown to Eastern Americans. Most importantly, they brought back first-hand accounts of the vast natural resources of the region and its potential for agriculture, mining, and trade. But Lewis and Clark weren't the only ones exploring the West. In the early 1800s, American interest in exploring and settling the Oregon Country intensified. This desire was driven in part by the belief in American exceptionalism, the idea that the United States had a special destiny to expand across the North American continent. This belief was rooted in the success of the American Revolution and the creation of a new kind of government based on Enlightenment ideals. It also reflected a growing sense of national unity among Americans. As more and more Americans moved to the Oregon Country, they brought with them ideas about how to govern and manage the lands they claimed. This included the concept of manifest destiny, the idea that the United States was destined by God to expand across the continent. While manifest destiny is often seen as a justification for westward expansion and the displacement of Native Americans, it's important to remember that it was just one of many competing ideas at the time. Many Americans were deeply concerned about the human cost of manifest destiny. People like John L. O'Sullivan, who coined the phrase manifest destiny, believed that expanding U.S. territory would bring freedom and democracy to Native Americans. But others saw the violence of westward expansion more clearly. In 1832, French writer Alexis de Tocqueville visited the United States and wrote about what he called the American Exchange. According to de Tocqueville, white Americans exchanged their respect for indigenous people for the right to dispossess them of their lands. He also argued that the democratic ideals that undergird the United States were fundamentally incompatible with the cultures of Native Americans. For these reasons, de Tocqueville predicted that Native Americans would either become assimilated into American society or be displaced altogether. Fortunately, his prediction proved to be true. As Americans continued to move west during the 1800s, they forcibly removed dozens of tribes from their ancestral lands, including the Cherokee. the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, the Creek, and the Seminole. These forced removals resulted in thousands of deaths and the loss of tribal lands that had been occupied for centuries. Despite this tragic outcome, the exploration and mapping of the Louisiana Purchase and the Oregon Territory laid the groundwork for future American expansion into the western half of the continent. And it did so thanks to a handful of well-funded expeditions, a handful of dedicated explorers, and a few key innovations. One of the most important developments during this period was the invention of new technologies that made it easier to travel and survive in the wilderness. For example, the American explorer John C. Fremont popularized the use of the snowshoe in the Rocky Mountains. And the invention of the steamboat allowed people to travel more easily up rivers like the Missouri. But perhaps the most important innovation was the development of the rifle, which gave hunters and explorers the ability to acquire food more easily and more efficiently. Okay, so we've learned that the United States grew dramatically in size with the acquisition of the Louisiana Purchase and the Oregon Territory. And we've seen that the acquisition of these lands was made possible by decades of exploration by both American pioneers and indigenous peoples. Next, let us explore how these new lands were organized and governed, and how new communities formed in the process. After winning independence from Britain, Americans created a new federal system of government with a strong central authority. But this system left many questions about governance in the Western Territories unanswered. Should these lands be admitted to the Union as full-fledged states? How would they be represented in Congress? What kinds of laws and policies should be put in place? These questions were debated for decades before finally being resolved in the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. The Northwest Ordinance outlined a path for the territories to become states. It also established a representative government in the Northwest Territory and banned slavery there, which made it the first territory to be admitted to the Union as a free state. But while the ordinance offered a blueprint for governing the Western Territories, it didn't address the issue of how to manage the transition from a relatively small and cohesive nation to a vast continental one. In the early 19th century, the United States looked very different than it does today. There were fewer people living in the country, fewer roads and cities, and the vast majority of the population lived along the East Coast. But as more and more people began to move west, the question of how to govern such a large and diverse population became increasingly urgent. To make matters worse, Americans were deeply divided over the issue of slavery. As settlers moved into new territories, they had to decide whether to allow slavery or not. This debate only grew more contentious as the country expanded. By the mid-1800s, the United States had grown to include vast areas of land in the Southwest and along the Pacific coast. But these lands were very different from the areas settled earlier in the century. For example, Texas had been part of Mexico until 1845, when it was admitted to the United States as a slave state. This decision caused a major shift in the balance of power between slave and free states, leading to increased tensions over the issue of slavery. Similarly, California's population nearly doubled between 1850 and 1860, thanks to a massive influx of people moving there during the gold rush. This rapid growth led to a constitutional convention in 1849, which resulted in the state's admission to the Union as a free state. These changes in the balance of power between slave and free states ultimately contributed to the start of the Civil War. Despite these challenges, the United States continued to grow throughout the 1800s. New states were admitted to the Union, territories were organized, and the country's population grew rapidly. This growth was driven in part by the completion of major infrastructure projects like the Transcontinental Railroad, which connected the eastern and western parts of the country for the first time. But as the United States approached the 20th century, it was clear that the challenges facing the nation had changed. Issues like civil rights, economic inequality, and environmental protection would require new approaches to governance and new forms of citizenship. So, as we wrap up this course, let's take a moment to reflect on everything we've learned. We've seen how the United States went from 13 colonies on the Atlantic coast to a vast country stretching from the Pacific to the Great Lakes. We explored the role of exploration and settlement in shaping the country's early history and considered the impact of westward expansion on Native Americans. And we've examined how the United States grew from a small and cohesive nation to a large and diverse one. We hope you've enjoyed learning about the fascinating history of the United States with us. Thanks for joining us.